Hello and welcome to today's talk on designing inclusive cultures for high-performing hybrid teams. And welcome once again. Really good that you're making this time here. And my name is Monica Chauhan Stock. A little bit about why I do what I do. So I grew up in India, and what seems like a really long time back, I moved to Switzerland. It was a huge culture shock, a very steep learning curve, and one of the big things I learned was that there are no right or wrong cultures, just different. And what started as a shock became my passion. I've lived in about 9 countries, worked in more than 60, and I'm currently based in London, along with Crossroads Global, which I founded, to really help people understand the why behind people's behaviors. So cultures aren't right or wrong, but they're different. And to understand the why behind people's behaviors and to understand why it makes complete sense to them, even if it makes none to you, is really the first and most important step in crossing cultures. So in this talk, I'll very quickly, in 30 minutes, take you through why culture can be sometimes a blind spot when we are working virtually, because we don't see people. Also, how unconscious bias, especially in hybrid teams, can lead us to, not understand why some people do what they do, and what are the deeper values behind the behaviors. And also, we look at what are some of the things you can do to have the cultural ability to, flex between different cultural styles and be globally, globally effective. So this is what we're going to look at in this talk. And please do bring your questions. This is really nice that you've made the time to come here. So if we look at teams by their very nature should be diverse. That's why we are a team. We bring different skills to complement each other. And if we look at homogeneous teams, they more or less average out in performance. We know each other in a team, predictable results, predictable performance for predictable things. But when the diversity comes in, whether it is distance or culture, we can see 2 kinds of responses. The performance can go down because there are misunderstandings, but as we know, diversity does give a dividend. In fact, research shows that there can be 33% or even more diversity dividend in terms of performance, innovation, collaboration, financial results. So how do we get to this green space where we see an increase in productivity? And that's where actually inclusion and the way we appreciate and understand cultural differences becomes very, very important. So inclusion is really the performance differentiator here. And I'm just going to unpack the term diversity. So when we say diversity, it can mean many things to us. Each person is unique. There's only one of us, as they say, one of you. So, each person, personality, introverts, extroverts. I heard a lot in the last 2 years how extroverts thrived while working virtually. Introverts struggled to get sometimes that engagement. So we have that personality that's at the core of each one of us. Then we have those very internal dimensions of diversity, the gender you identify with, the age, ethnicity, race. And then there is another area, which is an interesting area to unpack, because things like appearance is not something we will think about when thinking about diversity or inclusion. However, or a team for that matter. However, they impact unconsciously a lot of the ways that we form trust, or we reach out to people, or we like to work with others. So, for example, I'll take religion here. And many of you would agree that we do not talk about religion when we are working with somebody. It's not something that we think of right away. But when we are working in a hybrid team where people are based in different parts of the world, it is something that impacts our daily life. I've heard so many times teams that miss a deadline because they did not realize that there was a massive festival going on in another country. And I know you're based in India, so I hear a lot of times, for example, Diwali, which follows a lunar calendar, but is like Christmas in India, is something not very visible to somebody based in another country. And we could very easily miss some nuances where we can build relationships, where we can actually mitigate some of those misunderstandings. Again, dietary restrictions, for example, there's something that I have seen. We have had motivational seminars, a very good one going back to Paris, where we were in a wonderful chateau and a Michelin star chef, 150 affiliates from all over the world. And we realize as we start the dinner that 50% of the people cannot eat the main course or the dessert because there's either a dietary restriction or there are ingredients that are not okay for certain cultures. So I think small details matter. Again, things like educational background. We can have different perceptions about what credibility is. Is education giving you credibility? Is experience giving? And these are all the unconscious areas where hybrid teams struggle to unpack and start conversations on. So I definitely find this a very important area. And again, I would point out language and accent. So we speak English. English is the new international language, but do we really speak the same English? Research shows that we respond better to people who speak in a way similar to us, at the same pace, in a similar accent. Yet, this is something I hear again and again of how somebody who speaks German as their first language or another language struggle to make their point because people who speak English as their only language do not wait to let them form their opinion. So small things matter. And of course, then there's the organizational dimensions, how senior you are, what's your department, and how we will relate to these could be very cultural. Are we looking at status from a lens of, this is authority, this is credibility, or are we just looking at it as a functional, protocol? That's all. So I would say keep this in mind when we are talking about inclusion, because diversity is complex. There are many layers to it, and some are very, very unconscious, even to ourselves. For example, culture, which is often a blind spot when we are working virtually. And I often say, if you don't actively include, you exclude. Even if one person does not feel they are able to give their opinion, we have failed to make it an inclusive, high-performing culture. And yet, it is not easy to include because sometimes same values can show very different behaviors. And I'm going to share a personal anecdote here. So I have two children. When my son was 4 years old, he had broken something. And as I was speaking to him, he was looking into my eyes. Now, where I grew up in India, I was told by my parents that when you're talking to somebody older, especially when you've been not at your best behavior, you don't look into their eyes, you look down. And that's exactly what I told him. He seemed to understand, nodded his head, and looked down. After 15 minutes, he had broken something again. And then I heard his dad, who is Dutch, speak to him in Dutch and say, when you've been naughty and I'm speaking to you, you must always look into my eyes. Why are you looking down? So I realized we're trying to get the same value from this 4-year-old boy, which was respect, understanding, but asking him to demonstrate totally different behaviors. And I see this reflected again and again in teams that work hybrid, that work virtual, that work across different cultures. And how do we find and unpack these blind spots is an important part of unleashing higher performance. Cultural intelligence, matters even more today. I'm often asked, aren't we getting global? Isn't the world becoming one? Is it still necessary to understand cultures? And the fact is, the research shows, and I've been working in this area for about two decades, research shows that as we get more global, people start appreciating cultural authenticity even more. So when you can appreciate something that is very dear, very sensitive, or is a core value in a culture, you build trust instantly. And therefore, cultural intelligence matters more. There's 30% global, 70% local, as I say, which will help you unleash that higher performance. However, cultural intelligence is not easy. Very essential, but not easy. I'm going to share an example with you. I was running a workshop for executives in Thailand. As you know, Thailand is the country of 1,000 smiles. If you don't smile, people can get very nervous, they can get anxious, or they can think we're not having a good harmony in the room. So I was in the smile mode after a week, and then I was running a workshop for a group of Russian leaders, all of a certain gender and age. And I was in my smile mode. And after about an hour, my sponsor, Elena, took me aside and said, Monica, why are you smiling? Experts in Russia don't smile. So, body language, nonverbal cues, cultural intelligence doesn't come easy. But investing in it gives you a lot of results. However, when we are working, especially virtually, when we haven't got face-to-face context, biases, stereotypes, preconceived perceptions, they're all big barriers to getting that trust. So managing perceptions is the first and most important step when we start working across cultures, across distance, and with not full visibility of everyone. And how do we actually look at generalizations in a culture without stereotyping is a really important part. That's where the self-awareness starts. So when we are looking at perceptions, of course, there's a lot of proximity bias and affinity bias. We like people who are like us. Think about the 6 people you reach out to for input, personally and professionally. Who are your informal confidants? Chances are they are similar to you in more than one way. Maybe they are the same generation, maybe they are the same culture, maybe they just think like you. So you're going to get the yes on what you want to ask, and therefore we go to them. However, we limit ourselves from getting diverse perspectives there. And in a team, of course, we are limiting our chances of success the moment we default to what is unconsciously normal to us, or is our default comfort zone. So how can we stretch our comfort zone? How can we think beyond what seems obvious to us? And of course, this is important because what builds trust in one culture may burn trust in another. And that makes perceptions and uncovering these biases even more important. Proximity bias is a real thing. When we see somebody, we feel they are working hard. Are they not working when we don't see them? Well, this is something we need to be mindful of. So how do we get those nudges which we get in a physical space when we're not with the people in the same room? And fact is, we see what we want to see. We are ingrained to go back to our very, very deep perceptions, which are quite hard to uncover. We all have biases, by the way. Anthropologists say if you have a brain, you have a bias. So we can safely conclude that we are all biased in one way or another. So uncovering the deep culture, really important. And as you can see, there's so much there when we are working in teams, communication styles, how we are going to make a decision. How do we run a meeting, for example? Do we speak up? Or do we speak up only when somebody asks us? Is it the manager who speaks first? Or is it the expert who speaks first? All this is not so normal as we think, because they're cultural norms, and they're just as important as the norms that I might know or you might know for any person in their culture. So a typical mistake we can make is that what motivates me is what will motivate everyone else. If I need work-life balance, which means working 9 to 5, does that mean the same to my colleague in another part of the world? That's something I need to have a conversation about. So how does unconscious bias impact daily interactions in hybrid global teams, especially teams that work on a daily basis but have never met each other? Now, this is a really interesting one where I'm going to take a very, very typical example of communication. So you ask your colleagues who are based in China if things can be done by Monday. You get, yes, I think so. You believe, because you're quite direct here in UK, that probably Monday everything would be done. And you miss the I think so, which was actually the no you were getting in a very polite way. So what is direct and candid in one culture can be a microaggression in another because you've made somebody lose face. So how do we bridge this gap? How do we find out, and manage the impact of something that can actually burn or break trust? I'll share a personal anecdote. When I first arrived in UK, and I was coming from Netherlands then, so I was used to a very direct style of conversation. And I was pitching new ideas. I had a startup. I was pitching new ideas to investors. And I would often hear, it's an interesting idea. And I would think, oh, that's really good. They're interested in my idea. I'm going to send them more information. I'll get very optimistic and get no answer. And this would happen again and again and again, till a colleague took pity on me and said, you have to really hear the tone of interesting, because in England, interesting means it's the worst idea they've heard. So unpacking English in England was a good experience. And again, context matters, right? Context matters. There are people, there are cultures, there are technology channels which are very low context. What you say is what you get. Words are the full meaning. But then there are high context cultures where words actually mean nothing. You have to read the body language. You have to read the room, as they say. And even silence says a lot. And I'm going to share a quick anecdote here. When I lived in Tokyo, I went to visit a friend who was living in a high-rise building. And as I got into the elevator, there were two other women who got into the elevator. They were going they were going on the same floor, and one woman said to the other, "Oh, Akiko-san, it is so nice to meet you. I've been meaning to come and compliment you because your daughter plays the piano so beautifully. She's so talented, so hardworking. Every evening at 9 p.m., I hear her play the piano. So nice, so hardworking." And the other woman said, "Arigato gozaimasu," and they both went their way. Now, if you were low context, you might come back and ask your daughter to play more piano. But if you're high context, you do understand that 9 p.m. is a very important code, and your daughter shouldn't be playing the piano after 9 p.m. So, how much do you read into a message? How much do you miss in a message? Really depends here. And I see misunderstandings happen between teams every day based on what I read in a mail or what I don't read in an email, which, by the way, is a very, very low context channel. So it is not what is said, but what is understood that really matters when we are working across distance, across cultures. So I'm going to ask you, what is a good meeting? It would be good to get some words. What is a good meeting to you? And what is a good hybrid meeting for that matter? Any words? Right? Understanding each other. Yeah, okay. Anything else? What is a good meeting? Sorry? Productive. So come to a decision. Yeah. Any other comments there? Yeah. Outline objectives, right? We get there, we get the things done. Indeed, indeed. Different things for a good meeting. Now, culture can define what a good meeting looks like. So when I'm talking to my colleagues in UK, I usually hear a good meeting is where we come to a decision. We know what we are doing, objectives, right? But when I'm talking to my colleagues in France, I often hear we'd like to discuss, debate, hear different perspectives. When I'm talking to my colleagues in India, they say it would be good to make a formal announcement in the meeting, but let's decide things beforehand. So meetings before meetings become really critical here. And of course, what does a good hybrid meeting look like is another level. So if you're excluding even one person in a hybrid meeting, then probably it's not that inclusive. And again, culture matters here. So, if you look at a very individualistic culture like US, a person feels it's their personal responsibility to speak up. You do not need to wait to be invited. As they say, squeaky wheel gets the grease. But if we are looking at more interdependent, group-orientated cultures, harmony in a meeting is really important. So probably speaking up is a bad etiquette. As they say, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. So how do you make sure you can hear all perspectives? How do you norm a meeting where there's a balanced participation? Think about it. And of course, in hybrid, it's really important to think about what is it that you really want to discuss when we are all together. And I'd like to say, meetings before meetings, meetings after meetings, in general, irrespective of cultures, when we are working hybrid, are key to success in that actual meeting. The time management, because if we are not including everyone, if we are failing to include those who didn't come, we are missing a lot. So how can you enable inclusion and mitigate unconscious bias for higher performance? They say it takes only 7 seconds to build the first 11 impressions. So firstly, stop making judgments. Stop making quick judgments. Secondly, think about the messages you are sending. Maybe what you believe is building trust might be breaking trust. So turn your microaggressions to microaffirmations. Try to find out what the other person is actually expecting. And I think this is the key thing, aligning expectations, checking for assumptions. Because as I said, there are no right or wrong cultures, just different. So how do we align there? For example, if we are in a team, is your manager a micromanager or an absent leader? What does good leadership look like? And I'm going to share a research from INSEAD where there was a question asked, is it important for a manager to have at hand precise answers to most of the questions that subordinates may raise about their work? So in Sweden, only 10% people expected a leader to have answers. But in France, which is not very far, and in the same continent, 60% expectation from a leader to give precise answers. So what might look like good leadership in Sweden is absent leadership in France. And what's engagement in France could look like micromanagement in Netherlands or Sweden. So aligning expectations and sharing assumptions really, really important in a good hybrid, productive environment. So what matters most, however, in any team, whether hybrid, whether cross-cultural, or whether homogeneous, is trust. And I think it's important here to say that we need to find out what is important for people when building trust. And here, those cultural nuances, those personal points that make us so unique are really important to uncover and find out more about. So as we're coming to this end of this presentation, I'll hear your questions soon. I want to leave some time for questions. I want to say, what can you do? Because as an individual, we can all make a difference. We can all be agents of inclusion, agents of bringing positive change. So in global hybrid teams, look at building connections first. Prioritize relationships. because we can get transactional when we are working virtually. And it's even more important when we have no face-to-face connections to build those informal channels of getting feedback, finding out how people are doing, finding out a little bit about their well-being. They might be struggling and we can't see that. Or they might be actually really wanting to know what's going to happen next year. And we know that, but we've just not had that time for the conversation in a normal meeting. Also understand some cross-cultural nuances. What can, burn trust because somebody lost face? Maybe you need to be more direct because that person might not be reading into the context as you might be assuming them to. And also build your virtual competencies, which is a very practical skill. How you present online, how you talk to people, which meeting tools you use, all that can help, of course. And personally, I would say, find out more, be curious rather than furious, always helps. Frame how you work. Check for assumptions. Maybe people perceive something which is not correct about you. Go beyond culture, beyond diversity dimensions to be a human being there. And flex when you can to build relationships. Because I think when we have trust, when we have relationships, then we can start being authentic and really start letting people be more of themselves rather than less, and create that feeling of belonging. So I would say, if you want to, because you are here today, do write to us. We'll give you free access to an online profiler, which gives you the style that you work in and lets you go beyond that, frame of a culture or a person or a gender, and really gets to the your own unique style. And you can also map your team and see where the team is. For example, if the team has a very direct style and you're working with someone who is more indirect, probably there needs to be a little bit of flexing, or at least a dialogue to make it more inclusive. So if you would like, we'll give a free access to anybody who's attending this talk today. And of course, there's a selection of our programs. We run about 100 topics in 14 different languages, which can help you in various skills to be more productive as a hybrid cross-cultural team. So with this, I think I'd like to thank you for being curious about this topic, of spending this time with me. Thank you very much. And I'll invite any questions you might have. Thank you. Right, so that's really good. So you're saying, so beyond work, in social or personal interactions, if we are cross-cultural, what should we do? Different styles. Yeah. So I think personally, it's good to stretch and try to understand why somebody does what they do. And I can personally say I've had rich dividends of doing that. But it is important to have mutual respect. So I would say flex initially till you have formed relationships. And then you can start being what is you. For example, I have a friend who's very direct, but initially it was very difficult for me to be friends with her because it would seem that she wasn't caring about my feelings. But as I started understanding this is her style, and actually she's very reliable and very caring, and she says it from a good place, we started forming trust. And now actually we flex usually when we are having chit chat, and then she says, now I have to put my frame, my hat of being direct. And then she goes into that direct mode. So you can frame and switch styles, but I think socially there has to be mutual respect, definitely, of both styles. Thank you for asking that question. Anybody else? No question? Yeah? So flexing would be, for example, you're very direct, I'm indirect. So when you're talking to me, you realize if you are going to say no to, let's say, an invitation to attend a meeting directly, it might feel like a no to a relationship, a working relationship. So you might say, I really want to attend it, but it is really difficult for me. So can I probably have a recording of that meeting? And you have just had a longer conversation than a shorter one, and this is flexing. Whereas with somebody who's like your style of communication, you might just say, no, not today. That would be flexing. Takes time. It's a bit more stretching out of your comfort zone. Any other questions? Yeah? That's a really good question. So how can you get qualifications or get skills for, being cross-culturally competent? So one of the things we do is a masterclass. It's a global leadership masterclass, but it also talks about skills that you can develop while working with different cultures or having an international career. And of course, cultural competence is a top skill employers look for now, or companies look for. In fact, Harvard Business Review said that it was one of the top 3 leadership skills that are important now. So, and the second thing you can do is try to work volunteer for an international community body to just understand things. And the third thing is really get into the job, but go for a training. I would say it really helps to understand certain frameworks and then actively, understand your blind spots. Any other questions? I know we're kind of close to the time. So thank you again very much, and I hope to hear from many of you. Thank you.